valued audience. Trends Research and Advisory would like to welcome you to this e-lecture on oil market in the post-pandemic world as part of Trends Strategic Dialogue e-Forum. Let me start by saying that the demand for oil has fallen faster and further at any point in history. On the demand side, COVID-19 crisis led to a lower economic growth, less air travel, and other general reduction in demand. On the supply side, the major oil producers countries are continuing to disagree. This has worsened the demand even further. On April 12th, the world energy superpowers broke a new deal to increase price, but global demand flattened. International economic institutions project that global economy growth will reach around 5.8% in 2021. Should we forecast the return of oil prices to their normal levels as a result of recovery of the global economy? In this e-lecture, we will attempt to foresee the future of oil market for the global and MENA region by zooming in at the following: the macroeconomic landscape with emphasis in main economic indicators, microeconomic market industry terrain by examining oil and industry energy direction, the firm and corporate level by shedding lights on the company strategy and investment direction, the external sector and international economics to forethought trends in trade, investment, and finance. Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Mamdouh G. Salama, Director of Oil Market Consultancy based in the United Kingdom, an international oil economist and World Bank consultant, and a leading expert in the field who would help us to make sense of what is happening. Welcome, Dr. Salama.
Thank you very much indeed. It is with pleasure that I give this important lecture, and I thank you from the depth of my heart for your kind invitation. The title of my talk today is Oil Markets in the Post-Pandemic World, Current Prospects and Future Challenges. The coronavirus outbreak could go into history as the largest destructive event that has hit the global economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Indeed, its impact is already far bigger than both the financial crisis of 2008 and the 2014 oil price crash. There are indications that the adverse impact could be even bigger than the Great Depression of the 1930s. While both the financial crisis of 2008 and the 2014 oil price crash very adversely affected the global oil economy, the outbreak has paralyzed the global economy and brought normal economic activities to a virtual standstill, in addition to the immense damage inflicted on the global economy, which is yet to be assessed. 2020, meaning this year, started with positive projections that the global economy is set to grow at 3.3%, with global oil demand adding 1.2 million barrels a day over 2019. But this was not to be. The outbreak changed everything. The world has never ever faced such a more lethal and destructive cocktail of coronavirus outbreak, global recession, a huge glut in the global oil market, and an oil price war in the last 90 years. Already, economies around the world are shutting down. The US Federal Reserve has pumped trillions into the United States economy in just a matter of days. And this is just the first stage. We are heading into a years-long recession that will have far-reaching consequences, some of which we can predict with near certainty, and some of which will be entirely unpredictable. The International Monetary Fund is projecting that the global gross domestic product GDP will shrink by 3% from a projected 3.3 before the coronavirus outbreak and the resulting global lockdown to 0.3% this year. The IMF, however, is basing its projection on an assumption that the pandemic fades in the second half of this year and that containment measures can be gradually wound down. A positive sign is that China is already bouncing back extremely quickly in all sectors. This development will give a huge impetus to an oil market bereft with good news and may also prevent oil prices from sliding further downward. If anything, the coronavirus outbreak and its destructive power of the global economy and the global oil market has proven irrevocably how inseparable the relation between oil and the global economy by demonstrating that destroying one automatically destroys the other and vice versa. Estimates of the damage on the global oil demand vary, but they all overwhelmingly agree that the glut in the market has mushroomed to an estimated 1.8 billion barrels between globally stored oil and excess oil in the market, and the global oil demand has declined by an estimated 30 million barrels a day, with oil prices crashing to mid-20s. You can see on this chart how the Brent crude has declined from $60 in January to under 30, and in fact it reached almost 20 afterwards. With prices falling by more than 50% since hitting $60 a barrel in January, OPEC Plus met on the 6th and 7th March to discuss new production cuts to stabilize the oil price. Saudi Arabia called for deeper cuts amounting to 1.5 million barrels at a time when Libya's oil production has already lost 1 million barrels. Russia refused to agree cheaper cuts, arguing that OPEC's proposal for cuts of between 600,000 barrels a day and 1.5 million barrels a day would be a drop in the ocean in a market where oil demand is plunging fast. Considering that oil demand was at the time plunging by 15 million barrels a day and could reach 20 million barrels a day in coming weeks, influencing the market with the cuts proposed by Saudi-led OPEC would have been impossible. Russia's refusal was the last straw for Saudi Arabia, so it decided rashly to wage a price war against Russia and flood the global oil market with oil. The rationale of Russia's refusal is not without merit. Russian oil companies couldn't switch off oil production at their oil fields as easy as US shale oil, for instance. Moreover, any cuts will have no impact on oil prices without the United States doing its bit, which it will not. The US shale oil industry has been gaining more market share at the expense of OPEC Plus producers. Moreover, Russian oil companies have always been against any production cuts by OPEC Plus, arguing that they have invested heavily in expanding Russia's oil production capacity and therefore they wanted a quick return on their investments. They also argued that OPEC Plus cuts would have extended a lifeline to a sinking U.S. shale oil industry. The double supply-demand shock of the coronavirus in the oil market could lead to companies deferring as much as $131 billion worth of oil and gas projects slated for approval this year. President Trump has been blowing hot and cold about the price war. On the one hand, he threatened to invoke NOPEC bill to force Saudi Arabia to end the price war. Under NOPEC, the United States could sue OPEC for alleged price fixing. However, this is an empty threat, as OPEC is not a cartel and has never been one throughout its history. In fact, OPEC was established to confront the Seven Sisters who made the cartel of oil before they were nationalized. It will not stand scrutiny in a court of law. Moreover, it is the United States who has been manipulating oil prices for years by announcing figures for Saudi, for American shale oil production, higher figures or overstated figures every now and then. On the other hand, the United States and Saudi Arabia have been discussing the idea of setting up an oil accord. Bloomberg reports, citing U.S. Energy Secretary Dan Brulett, such an accord would effectively amount to a cartel, which by definition is a group of independent market participants agreeing to act together to influence the market in a way favorable to them. But no decision has been taken yet. However, for the United States to join Saudi Arabia in a new cartel proves not only that it is a hypocrite, but it also undermines the NOPEC bill and exposes the United States double standards where its interests are involved. It has become patently obvious that efforts by OPEC Plus in the past to deplete the glut and arrest the slide of oil prices are being undermined by the U.S. shale oil industry recklessly producing even at a loss and gaining market share at the expense of OPEC members. Now about the U.S. shale oil industry, since its inception in 2008, the U.S. shale oil industry has never been a profitable industry. If it was judged by the strict commercial criteria by which other successful companies are judged, it would have been declared bankrupt years ago. U.S. shale drillers have been encouraged by easy money, easy liquidity provided by Wall Street and other investors to continue production even at a loss to pay some of their debts. In so doing, their outstanding debts have mushroomed to almost $1 trillion, leading to large number of bankruptcy among them. And with a break-even price ranging from 48 to 68 barrels, and with a well depletion rate of 70 to 90% after first year production compared to 5% in the Gulf, the overwhelming majority of shale drillers cannot survive low oil prices, let alone a price war. At $30 to $35 oil, U.S. shale oil production could drop by around 1.5 million barrels according to Russia's oil ministry. Still, the Trump administration is under pressure to keep the industry alive, even if on a live support machine, not only because it is a $7 trillion industry employing more than 2% of the workforce of the United States, and therefore very important for the US economy, and also because it enables the United States to have a say in the global oil market along with Russia and Saudi Arabia. Many ideas are being considered for bailing out the shale oil industry, including an import tax or tariff on foreign oil export to the US. One of these ideas sees the United States imposing a fee on imported oil or products. It engenders setting a floor price of $50 a barrel. So if the import price goes down, for instance, to 30, then an import fee of $20 per barrel would be levied by the United States Treasury. Likewise, if the import price is 50 a barrel or higher, then no fee is paid. This is no more than an opportunistic way to fleece the oil exporting countries and bail out the shale industry at their expense. Because of the oil price war, the shale oil industry was decimated. So President Trump put pressure on Saudi Arabia to end the war. At first, Saudi Arabia declined or resisted pressure, but a group of 6 US senators wrote a letter to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the last week of March, saying that Saudi Arabia and Russia have embarked upon economic warfare against the US. Eventually, Saudi Arabia succumbed to President Trump's pressure and called for an emergency meeting of OPEC Plus for the 9th of April because it no longer can bear losses from the oil war. The fact that Saudi Arabia called for an urgent meeting of OPEC, having rejected before calling a meeting to discuss ways to stabilize the global oil market, is an admission of the failure of the oil price war it waged against Russia. Saudi Arabia knew that its oil price war will eventually backfire on it. OPEC Plus eventually agreed production cuts of 10 million barrels a day, and with another 5 million barrels coming from G20 producers from outside OPEC, such as Norway, Mexico, Brazil, and Canada. President Trump refused to announce cuts, saying that only free markets will determine US production cuts. Put bluntly, he is not going to agree any cuts. This raises a serious moral question also about where were the free markets then when US shale oil producers have been for years taking advantage of OPEC cuts to enhance their market share at the expense of OPEC members by producing excessively even at a loss and undermining OPEC's efforts to support oil prices by trying to cap the prices. At one time, they wanted the price not to go above $50. Another time in 2018, they wanted to stop the price going above 60. Shale oil producers didn't even spare a thought for other oil producing nations of the world whose livelihood they have trampled on for years, with the full knowledge that US taxpayers will bail them out even when their outstanding debts are heading towards 1 trillion. They had a chance recently to redeem themselves by cutting production and join OPEC Plus to stabilize oil prices, but they adamantly refused. They continued to show the ugly face of capitalism. They paid for their greed and obstinacy by the recent collapse of the WTI crude oil price to less than $1 a barrel. As if this is not enough, as I mentioned before, President Trump is toying with the idea of imposing either a tax or a tariff, it amounts to the same thing, on foreign oil export to the United States. But this may not work at all, since major oil exporters like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Russia might shift all their exports to the bigger market, which is the Asia Pacific region, rather than pay the tax. Now, what about the impact of OPEC's cuts on oil prices? I have always maintained that no matter how big the cuts are, as long as the coronavirus outbreak is raging, it will have no positive impact on oil prices. That was proven when OPEC announced reduction of 10 million barrels. Immediately the following day, oil prices dropped. Now the market is demanding more cuts with probably the same failed result. How could a 10 million production cut or even 20 million production cut impact positively on oil prices, sagging under the weight of a glut estimated at 1.8 billion barrels a day between oil stored around the world and excess oil in the market, and a global oil demand declining by 30 million barrels a day. Against this backdrop, just days after the largest production out in history, WTI fell below 20 per barrel. The cuts were massive, but then the glut was far, far bigger, and the decline in global oil demand was even bigger. April demand is expected to be down by 29 million barrels a day, according to the International Energy Agency. Oddly, so many forecasts by investment banks are predicting a V-shaped recovery for the global economy, but that scenario appears increasingly optimistic. You can see the V-shape on the chart, like we started in January this year, how the coronavirus caused it to dip very deep down. Then now the projection is that it will recover and resume its way as it was before. Against this backdrop, the OPEC deal is unable to engineer an immediate rebound in pricing. There is no feasible agreement that could cut supply by enough to offset such near-term demand, according to the IEA. Meanwhile, rather than talking about cuts, it's far better for countries of the world, whether they are oil producers or oil consumers, to implement the strict measures that enable China to control the outbreak and open the country to business again. This will certainly shorten the lockdown, the duration of the global lockdown, and enable people to resume their normal activities, including demand for crude oil, rather than wasting their time making cuts which are futile in the current circumstances. I don't say that cuts don't work, but they work after the coronavirus has been controlled, but they don't work while it is raging. Now, China comes to the rescue. One positive sign on the horizon is China's opening up after it successfully managed to control the coronavirus. China is already bouncing back extremely quickly in all sectors, except those relating to the service industries, with projections already bound that China could grow at 6.8% in 2021 compared with 6.1% in 2019. Given the speed by which China is bouncing back, It could be projected to grow at 4 to 5% in the second half of this year, compared with 3 to 3.5% in the first half, the one we are in. Moreover, China will be hugely thirsty for crude oil. This development will give a huge impetus to an oil market bereft of good news, but may also prevent oil prices from sliding downward further. The restarting of China coincides with the shutting down of most of the world's economy, causing lower commodity prices. Every crisis offers opportunities, and China, including this one, China is seizing the opportunity of super low oil prices to expand its strategic oil reserves before prices rise again. It is also stocking up on cheap LNG. Chinese companies imported about 1.26 million tons of LNG in the week of March 23, which is the first time it is risen above 2019, meaning that China is back in business. This couldn't have come at a better moment for the global LNG industry, as prices have sunk to historic lows. As you can see in this chart, US LNG, now the break-even prices are even higher than the prices of LNG in the global oil market. So the LNG of the United States will face problems. Qatar might avoid that to some extent, being the cheapest. The same with Australia, because it is nearer to the Asia-Pacific region where the demand is than the United States. What about oil markets in the aftermath of the coronavirus outbreak? Oil demand is expected to be down by nearly 30 million barrels a day in April, and down by almost 10 million barrels for the whole year. That's understandable. Still, the IEA assumes that there is a resurgence of demand close to normal levels by the end of the year. But there are multiple reasons why the global economy may not return to anything close to normal. Nobody is expecting the global economy to return to normal. But as long as it is growing upward, that's what matters. The reason, there are two reasons for that. One principal reason is that the global pandemic is far from over, and the lockdown in the major economies of the world will be gradually opened, not at full blast. The second reason is that some of the major economies are really in trouble, particularly the United States economy. Just days ago, President Trump said the economy could boom once the lockdown measures are lifted. However, a new working paper from the American National Bureau of Economic Research says that US GDP could contract by 11% in the fourth quarter of 2020, year on year compared with 2019. An estimated 22 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance in the last 5 weeks in the US, and many of those jobs may not come back later this year. Ultimately, economic activity may not rebound fully until a vaccine is readily available, or at least until a robust system of testing that allows for reopening of sections of the economy. Despite the dire warnings, there is growing optimism that once the outbreak is contained, the global economy, and China's in particular, will behave like a patient who has been quarantined with no food. Once out of the quarantine, his appetite could be rapacious. And this is exactly how the global economy and the global oil market will react, with oil imports doubling, if not tripling, to recoup lost demand. Oil prices and demand will recoup all their previous losses, with prices eventually touching $50 to $60 a barrel in the second half or the end of the second half of this year. Now, there is always talk by people who project about the future about an imminent global energy transition, meaning a transition of the world from hydrocarbons like oil and natural gas into renewable energy. My view is that this is an illusion. Energy is the fundamental need of our everyday life, so much so that the quality of life and even its sustenance is dependent on the availability of energy. Now, there will always be four pivotal realities which will govern the global energy scene well into the future. The first reality is that there will be no post-oil era throughout the 21st century and far beyond. It is very doubtful that an alternative as versatile and practicable as oil, particularly in transport, could totally replace oil in the next 100 years and beyond. The second reality is that there will be no peak oil demand, meaning no decline in global demand of oil. Although while an increasing number of electric vehicles on the roads, coupled with government environmental legislation, could slightly decelerate oil demand, reducing it, let's say, from 1.7% to 1.5%. EVs or electric vehicles could never replace oil in global transport throughout the 21st century and far beyond. Therefore, one should not get fooled by the rush of car makers towards investing in electric vehicles. This is being forced upon them by government regulations and also by wanting to burnish their environmental credentials rather than by business sense. The third reality is that the notion of a global imminent energy transition is an illusion. In fact, the percentage of fossil fuels in the world's energy mix, coal, oil, and natural gas, is still lingering well above 80%, a figure that has changed little in 30 years. That remains the case despite being challenged by serious environmental policies and despite a global expenditure of $3 trillion in the last 10 years by renewable energy. This is a hefty price to pay just to gain a 1 percentage point of market share from coal. The fourth reality is that oil and gas will continue to be the core business of the global economy and the global oil industry. For energy transition to accelerate, it should have three realistic objectives: benefit to the users, practicability, and lucrative financial returns from renewables, at least comparable to those from oil and gas. Now, we know that the coronavirus outbreak has sharpened the race for the new order of the world by the bashing of China because it came out of the coronavirus first. The world will not be the same in the aftermath of the coronavirus outbreak. And while the outbreak has shocked the world to its foundation, it may have also sharpened the race for the next world order and who will emerge the dominant power of the 21st century. The extraordinary measures China has taken under the leadership of President Xi Jinping have enabled it to control the outbreak and open the country to business. Maybe countries of the world, including the United States, could learn a lesson from China on how to stop the outbreak in its tracks in such a short time. Instead of praise, the bashing of China, particularly in the United States, from neoconservative scholars accusing China with falsifying figures, is unabated. However, this is no more than sour grapes on the part of China bashers. China wouldn't falsify figures because to do that would have risked plunging 1.4 billion Chinese into the worst health disaster in the history of mankind. It's absolutely right for China, therefore, to resume its position as the workshop of the world and the driving force behind the global economy and the global oil demand growth in its capacity as the world's largest economy based on purchasing power parity. For the global market, global oil market, it will be a badly needed shot in the arm. And while the coronavirus outbreak might show an aspect of rivalry between the United States and China, the rivalry between them goes far beyond productivity and whoever recovers first from the coronavirus. It is about the next world order and who will emerge as the dominant power of the 21st century. It's also about the petro-yuan supplanting the petrodollar as the oil currency of the world. The inevitable rise of China is being underpinned by the fact that it's currently the world's largest economy, the workshop of the world's largest importer of crude oil, and the Belt and Road Initiative, and above all, the Russian-Chinese strategic alliance, which will lead the new world order in the 21st century and will shape it too. The Road and Belt Initiative has enabled China to integrate its economy in the global trade system far more than the United States. That's why China won the trade war with the US. Moreover, by offering loans and helping most countries of the world modernize their infrastructure and starting wealth creation projects, China's economy is benefiting immensely by expanding the market for its global trade. A very serious potential lurks behind China's rise in the United States. Conclusion, the coronavirus outbreak could go into history as the largest destructive event that has hit the global economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. It will change the way we live in more ways than one. OPEC-led global production cuts, no matter how big they are, will hardly have a positive impact on oil prices while the outbreak is raging. And while the global oil demand will face a steep uphill struggle to recoup lost ground, it will start to recoup its losses from the second half of this year with help from China bouncing back extremely quickly from its ordeal, with oil prices even touching 50 to 60 a barrel earlier next year or by the end of this year. Geopolitically, the coronavirus outbreak might have sharpened the race for the next world order and who will emerge the dominant power in the world. And with that, I finish my lecture and thank you for listening. And I am more than happy to answer any questions you have.
We would like to thank Dr. Salama, Director of Oil Market Consultancy and World Bank Consultant, for his valuable information and informative account. And we would like to open the floor for audience questions. I have a couple of questions, Dr. Salama, that addresses these important issues. And one of them, will the oil price resume rising with so many countries pursuing a reopening policy?
Did I understand you that will other oil producing countries commit to cutting production?
No, the question is, with so many countries are reopening their economy, would that have an impact on the oil price?
Of course it will.
Sure.
As we know, most of the global economy, or at least half of the population of the world, are already in lockdown. This means they cannot, to start with, use cars or fly in planes. And that is a big chunk of the global demand for oil. And with the global, most of the major economies of the world being in quarantine, we expect that it's natural that the oil demand will decline. However, the minute they start to open up, even gradually, we will see that the demand for oil will start to grow. And I might add, the demand for LNG and gas as well will start to grow. It will grow and gain momentum as the size of the lockdown is reduced.
Okay. My second question is, of course, related to the Gulf region, which is a major player in the global oil industry and the global economy. And the question is, do you expect the GCC economy to fully recover?
Of course.
When? The question is actually when the GCC economy will fully recover.
The Gulf producers are in a way lucky. They have great reserves of oil. Their production is very cheap. And furthermore, they have a cushion to keep them alive and keep their economy alive in the near future. So, although the damage to their economies in the short term is big in terms of loss of revenue, which everyone has lost, in terms of enlarged budget deficit as well, which everyone will have. But they have enough financial cushion to tie them up until the global demand improves and until prices move up. However, if God forbid the coronavirus and its destructive impact continues for more than a year, we will have real problems even with the rich Gulf economies.
Okay, another question is, Doctor, how will the Gulf countries or economy deal with the problem of the collapse of the oil price, or how they should deal with it, how they should mitigate the risk? What kind of policies do you recommend in that regard?
The first reaction any government will take, whether it's UAE or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Kuwait, is to cut government expenditure. That's the first reaction and the correct one, because they know that by cutting the expenditure, they are putting the seeds for a better future next, and they are capable of rebuilding the expenditure later when oil prices improve. So for the time being, they have to do this thing, mainly cutting government expenditure, shelving any investment for the time being, or the financing of major products which can wait for a while. Once they have done that and prices have started to go and their income has improved, they can easily come back and enhance the government expenditure and investment allocation. So we are not in very real risk, but only if the coronavirus lasts far longer. I don't think it will last far longer, and I think that the second half of this year will begin to see the start of the end of the coronavirus, either with the vaccine or with the opening or reduction of the lockdown around the world, and the demand for oil will grow, and with that, the economic position of the Gulf producers and oil producers around the world will start to improve.
Yes, Dr. Salam. We have another question from one of the audience. It's an interesting question. As it says that there is a prediction that the position of China as the global manufacturing center will decline, and that countries will become self-sufficient in terms of their industrial and manufacturing capabilities, and that definitely would have impact on China's growth projections. How would that affect the oil prices?
You and I know that China is the driver of the global economy, particularly the driver of the global oil demand and the oil demand growth. It accounts for 80% of the normal growth of the global oil demand, and at the same time, it is the biggest importer of oil. By December 2019, its imports averaged almost 11 million barrels a day. It consumes around 15 million barrels a day in normal circumstances. Now, there is no doubt that the destructive impact of the coronavirus outbreak has affected China as a major economy, like any other economy. But China has rebounded now, and it's bouncing back. And there are claims that it might have lost 2 to 2.5% of its normal growth rate for a mature economy, which is 6%. I mentioned in my lecture that in the first half of this year, its growth rate might have declined between 2.5% to 3%, but it will be rising to 4 to 4.5% in the second half. However, if the opening continues, China's economy, according to the International Monetary Fund, is projected to grow 6.8% in 2021 compared with 6.1% in 2019. This means that China will carry the global oil market with it, and it is already purchasing huge amounts of oil, even at this minute, for its strategic reserves and taking advantage of low oil prices. And every businessman, a clever businessman, will do exactly that. Buy when it is cheap, store it, and use it later. It will help their balance of trade and their budget hugely. But don't believe what the world tells you. There are many politically motivated experts who talk about a decline in China's economy. China's economy is the biggest in the world based on purchasing power parity, which is the measure the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank use to compare the GDPs of the world, and not the nominal which doesn't take into account the inflation adjustment. So with being the biggest economy in the world, it will carry the global demand with it and the global economy with it.
Okay, we'll touch on some behavioral economics here, and I think it's in reference to something that you have mentioned. And you said that the economy will behave like a patient who has been quarantined for some time, and then unleashed into the market, into the into the and that gives us a sense of how the recovery will be, the prospect will be in the future. Can you shed more light on this, please?
Yes, I mean, I used a term, and that's my own words. I said that the global economy and China's economy will behave like a patient who has been in quarantine for a long while with no food. Once you let him out and you offer him food, he will eat rapaciously. This is exactly the situation with the global economy and China. China is already happening. That is the situation with the global economy. It will tend to eat, or in this case, not eating, it will tend to double, if not triple, their global demand for oil. And that will help accelerate not only the demand, but the recovery of the global oil industry. We must remember one thing. Despite those who talking about peak oil and that we are seeing in the last days with oil, take it from me that oil, the global economy, cannot exist without oil, and vice versa. Oil is the blood of the global economy, and oil will be with us throughout the 21st century and far beyond that.
Yes, Doctor. Yes, just a general note. Saudi Arabia is we are a strategic partner. We are our brothers, and we want to project that, and we want to make sure that we stand side to side in this crisis, and we will, inshallah, recover out of it. The questions that we need to that we want to address is a bit on the again the macroeconomics, and it says how would this will hurry the process of diversification? What kind of impact it would have on diversification policies in the region?
Well, as you know, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has his idea of the Saudi diversification of the economy, what he called it the Saudi vision. And it was based on selling a share in Aramco to finance the non-oil sector in the Saudi economy. In other words, he wanted to sell 5% of that to get $100 billion to invest it in the non-oil sector of Saudi Arabia. And the whole objective is to diversify the Saudi economy so that it is not all the time subject to the volatility of oil prices and subject to one day we have high oil prices and one day the price collapses. He wanted to diversify the economy, which oil producers in the Gulf should have done it years ago. But I would say never too late. He is in the right direction. The current reduction in oil prices and global demand will affect the Saudi vision of 2030 and any other visions in the United Arab Emirates as well. However, it will be a temporary stop or temporary pause, because once oil prices start to improve and the revenue starts to come in, the diversification will go ahead. And it is a must, it must go ahead, because without that, all the major economies of the Gulf will be always subjected to, will be at the mercy of the oil price. With diversifying it, it will do them a lot of good, and it will make their economy grow hugely. One thing they can do, and already the United Arab Emirates is leading the Gulf in that, in fact, leading is one of the foreigners in the world in that, which is the use of not only diversification, but renewable energy. For instance, if you take Saudi Arabia in particular, Saudi Arabia uses oil for electricity generation and as well as a bit of gas. And also it uses oil mostly for the water desalination plants from which Saudi Arabia drinks. Now, part of the diversification could be using solar power to power desalination plants, replace oil there, and for electricity generation to replace oil. First, that will give them extra revenue. Second, they can do more than that. They can export half of their crude oil, and the rest can be refined and sold as refined products. They can create the biggest petrochemical industry in the world. They have the reserves, they have the gas, and the industry is already there. So all this diversification will be carried forward when prices improve and when the country starts to earn more, and that applies to all the economies of the Gulf.
That's right, Dr. Salama, because Saudi Arabia is a major player in the oil industry, and for any grand bargain to stand and to continue, we need, of course, the Gulf and Saudi Arabia at the center of it, and other GCC country as well, and that would not have impact, of course, regionally, but also would have a global impact. The other question that I would like to that came from actually from one of the audience is you mentioned that there is a kind of a competition between the petrol yuan and the petrodollar. Can you shed light on that, and what are the implications?
Of course. We all know about the petrodollar because global oil is priced in dollar. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States economy emerged as the biggest economy with the least damage to their territory. But since after the Second World War, they had the Korean War and Vietnam, which meant that America had huge deficits in its budget. At that time, immediately after the Second World War, according to Bretton Woods agreements, the dollar emerged as the #1 currency, reserve currency of the world, supported by gold. Hence, the name, the gold system. But the Nixon administration in the early 70s noticed that the deficit in the US budget has become so big that all the oil, all the gold in Fort Knox wouldn't cover the deficit, because everybody then had accepted the dollar on the fact that the dollar is pegged to gold. And if you, like in UAE, had dollars, you could easily go to the American Treasury and ask to receive it in gold. And at that time, the ounce of gold was estimated at $35 US. When Nixon found that they don't have enough gold to cover all the deficit and the outstanding debts, they took a drastic decision, which is to get out of the gold system. In other words, depend on the dollar and the power of the American economy. However, to ensure the success of it as a dollar, as a petrodollar, the first thing they did, America negotiated with Saudi Arabia, and the deal was Saudi Arabia will price its oil and sell it in dollar exclusively. It was the case. 2 years after that, that was 1973. 2 years after that, OPEC members joined the arrangement, so all their oil is priced and sold in dollar. Now, that gave the United States a huge advantages, because the oil business is 1/3 of the global economy. As you know, the global economy is made of 3 big chunks: the oil industry, the economies of the oil producing nations and global investments. That gave the United States huge advantages in a currency. It can print at will and buy oil with it. And so the oil money came to the United States, and this enabled the American economy to expand hugely, but also it gave the United States the power to impose sanctions on any country they don't see eye to eye with, as it's happening in Iran, Russia, Venezuela, any country, name it, Syria, name it, and it is the same case. Now, the Russians and the Chinese have been working together to reduce the impact of the petrodollar on their economies. Eventually, China came up in March 2018 with the petro yuan, the yuan, the Chinese currency, but I named it petro yuan because they will use it like comparable to the petrodollar. Already, the petro yuan has got a big chunk of the global oil business by the fact, helped by the fact that China is the biggest importer of oil. So the China oil market now, Shanghai oil market, is gaining quite a big momentum. The Chinese aim with the Russians to undermine the dollar. That's clear-cut case. And if they do that, it will undermine the American financial system. And if that happens, it means it will undermine the global financial system as we know it now. But the Chinese are offering something good because they are offering currency which is supported by gold as well. So in that case, my view as an economist is that all of them will be still in the market even 20 to 30 years from now. Maybe the petro yuan will gain ahead of the dollar, but the dollar will still be there. Maybe the petro yuan might take a 50% chunk of the oil market. The petrodollar might still have 30%. Other currencies, the euro, the European Union is thinking of using the euro as a petro currency as well. The yen, the Japanese are taking the same way. So all of them, each one will get a share of that.
Yes. So now we have another question from the audience, I think, which looks at the cooperative model. I mean, in times of epidemics, in times of crisis, a global economic crisis, and we are facing a single challenge. So there is a need for a global cooperation on that involve the major players, whether it was specifically in the oil industry and also in the economies in general. Let's include the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and many other countries to uplift, to work cooperatively to uplift the oil market and the oil industry, enhance the global economy. Do you have any insight on that? Do you have any view how that could happen right now?
Well, one thing, Saudi Arabia, for instance, and Russia know that it is better for them to cooperate because between them, they have at least more than 25% of global production. And maybe I would say another 25% of global exports. So it's better for Russia to continue dealing with OPEC, at least to synchronize and stabilize prices. However, one thing I can see happening, I don't see a future for US shale oil industry. However, the American government cannot afford to let it die. So what will happen in coming months and the coming 2-3 years is that those who are strong enough financially to remain in the market will stay in the market. In other words, the US shale oil industry will be leaner and slightly meaner, but much smaller than that. And as a result, the Americans will become a big importer of oil as they used to be. Currently, even with their claim that the U.S. shale industry is producing 12 to 13 million barrels a day. They are still importing 8 to 9 million barrels. So if the shale oil industry is leaner, it means by definition it will produce less. And if it produces less, it means that America's oil imports will have to increase. And I would see the day when the Americans will start to import 11 to 12 million barrels in the next 5 to 6 years.
Okay. Another question is after this course there is some talks. I mean, people are having some discussion about the new economic order, the post-COVID world economic order, and how China is gaining a bigger momentum, bigger role in it, or some others disagree with that. For those people who agree with that, do you see that their economic model can be transposed in the region? There, in terms of the idea of a capitalist state capitalist model.
As far as I can tell, there will be a lot of questions about the current economic model of the world. For instance, globalization might be less important in the global economy than nationalistic policies. President Trump started the policy by America first, make America great, America first. I think many other countries might follow that policy, or on the other hand, at least might feel the need to defend their economies against what you call encroachment by the Americans. For instance, China will continue to expand globally, even if there is a trade war, if the trade war with the Americans is renewed, because I suspect President Trump is keen on starting trouble either with Iran or with China in terms of trade war to cover up the destruction of the American economy. I mentioned in my lecture that the national statistics of America say there could be 11% decline in the GDP of America in the fourth quarter of this year. Some other studies are talking about 20% for the time being. So to cover that, he might start trouble either with Iran or with China. But let's say he started, after he opened his economy, he started trouble with China by imposing further tariffs. China's economy is more integrated in the global economy than America's economy. Consequently, it will suffer far less than America's economy. Furthermore, with the what you call Belt and Road Initiative, or the Silk Road as we know it, China has more opportunities to expand its economy in the world. So I can see a continued growth in China's economy, a continued decline in America's economy, and troubled trade war between the two countries, which might adversely impact on the global economy to some extent.
Yes, Dr. Salama. The questions, one of the audience, I mean, there's lots of questions, but I think at a certain point we have to also look at the time here. So now, what would happen to the oil companies, specifically in the when you speak about the major players? I mean, what are their interest in it? Whether it was in Russia, whether it was in the U.S., whether it was in other parts of the world, how they behave, how they would react to policies by government, and how they would become part of this what is called great bargain.
If you want the truth, I didn't get the question clearly.
The question is how the oil companies and the firms' strategies.
That's it. Yeah, I got it now. The oil, go back to the 2014 oil price crash. At that time, it was a major crash, as I mentioned in my lecture, that the price of oil went as low as $30 from 110 to 120. That was a huge crash, particularly for the oil majors. The first thing they reacted on is they started selling assets. They delayed all their investment, and many of their projects they shelved aside.
Okay.
So that's what happened in 2014. Now we have a problem which is far bigger than 2014 in terms of the level of oil prices and in terms of the losses. Now, oil companies are facing huge debts, but so far they have refused to cut the dividends for shareholders because they hope that with improvement in oil prices, their earnings will improve and they will continue to earn more investment through paying dividends. But they are reaching a stage now. Either they cancel many of their assets, sell many of their assets, or cancel many of their future projects, or cut the dividends. I think the critical decision is to cut the dividends. If they cut the dividends, they can reduce their outstanding debts, and what they save from the dividends, they can use to finance future projects. Still, for the next few years, they will have to cut their expenditure hugely. And I heard that British Petroleum now is saying that they have reduced their expenditure to the extent that they can live with a $35 barrel. If that is true, that could be a trend for other oil companies, major oil companies. In other words, they will have to cut their expenditure so much to be able to live with that level of prices. But in doing that, they are creating the seeds of future oil crisis, because if they sell their assets and reduce their expenditure on new projects, what will happen in 10 years from now? The global oil demand will overtake global supply, and then we can see prices possibly hitting 120, 130, 150, who knows? So that is what's happening.
And what is the best strategy they can pursue? What is the recommendation for the
Well,
strategy?
I recommended that in my comments to oilprice.com. I said they have no alternative but to cut their dividends rather than cut the financing for projects. So to remain alive and to remain in the market. And that could obviate or could offset any possibilities of a crunch in 5 to 10 years from now. We are talking now at prices at $20, but nobody would believe it if I am not saying to you that there could be a crunch in the next 5 to 10 years where prices could hit $140. But then oil surprises the world all the time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dr. Salama. We have reached the end of this program. We have one last question, and says the question is on the future prospect of the price of oil. What do we expect it to be in 2021, beginning first quarter 2021?
Well, I think I partially answered it, but if the lockdown starts to ease and major economies start to open up, like China, United States, European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Mexico, for instance, we will see an improvement in the oil price. I am projecting that if that happens, we can see a price 40 to 50, maybe even touching 60 at the end of this year, the start of next year. After that, if things continue to go, I think it's easy to say we can hit 75 and onward.
Okay. Now we come at the end of the program. We'd like to thank you, Dr. Salama, and also we'd like to emphasize the importance of Saudi Arabia and the GCC and other players in the oil industry, and the important they play and the role that they have, and to create the grand bargain, or create a bargain that works for everybody, and the price that is suitable and acceptable by all parties. Dr. Salama, Director of Oil Market Consultancy and World Bank Consultant, we'd like to thank you for your effort and expertise in explaining to us and the audience the future prospect of oil market, both at the macroeconomic, industry, and microeconomic level. And this was highly informative. We would be happy to have you back. Dear valued audience, I'd like to make an announcement as part of strategic dialogue, trends and research and advisory. Would like to invite you to an e-forum titled Using Artificial Intelligence to Tackle Epidemic, the COVID-19 Model, which will take place on Wednesday, May 6, 2020 at 9 p.m. Abu Dhabi local time. Thank you, Dr. Salama. Thanks a lot for your valuable information, for your thoughts, for your explanation, and for making sense of what is going on. It was very informative sessions, and we hope to have you again to shed lights on developments on the energy market. Thanks a lot.
I thank you a lot.